And welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is befriending the ego. We often vilify the ego and treat it as an adversary that we have to destroy or overcome. And I'm wondering what might be possible if we were to befriend the ego and engage it as an ally. So who knows what might be possible. Let's take a few minutes before we get started, though. Good morning, Robert. Before we get started, welcome. It's great to have you here. Let's just take a couple minutes to get present. And so let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing every organ, all your physical body. And as you exhale any tension, any stress, negativity, or fatigue. And then let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, energizing, electrifying all your electrons, all your molecules, lighting up your cells from the inside out. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, or fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together, really softly, gently rub your fingers against your palms to feel that delicious sensation and bring yourselves present right here, right now. Welcome, Julie. It's been a long time. So good to have you back. So today we're talking about befriending the ego. And I think that there's such a, that the ego gets a really bad rap, and that it can be engaged as an ally to enrich our lives. You know, I did look up the definition of ego because I thought that would be a great jumping off point. So I'm going to read that. I nerd out on this stuff. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me. So ego, the I or self of any person, a person as thinking, feeling, and willing, and distinguishing itself from the selves of others and from objects of its thought. Good morning, Andrea. Welcome. It's great to have you here. We're talking about befriending the ego. So before we even get started, we're going to get clear on at least what the dictionary says the ego is. And then in the context of psychoanalysis, the ego is the part of the psychic apparatus that experiences and reacts to the outside world, and thus mediates between the primitive drives of the id and the demands of the social and physical environment. Good morning, Dennis. So good to have you here. We're talking about the ego and befriending the ego. So those are the definitions. And if we look at the philosophy-based or oriented definition, the ego is the enduring and conscious element that knows experience. So good morning, Curry. I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but welcome. It's great to have you here. So we're talking about befriending the ego because, as I said a minute ago, I think the ego gets a really bad rap. We want to talk about in spiritual transformation, the ego is often the villain that is responsible for all the negative attachments and reactions. The thing is that the ego is also the mediator, right? So the ego is also responsible for our positive reactions. And when we talk about egotism or egocentric, then we're maybe talking about a perversion of the ego, like where there's an imbalance of the ego. But what if there's a balance? The ego is the tool through which we interface with the world. And so I'm wondering, when we learn to be kinder and gentler to ourselves, what is it that's doing that? That's the ego also, right? It's ego behaviors, it's ego profiles, shall we say. You know, when typically we talk about when we experience our suffering, we experience that as an effect of the ego. And in the purest sense, that's true, because it is the ego that is the navigation tool through the world, and part of our GPS, so to speak, for navigating through the world is judgment. Hello, Josie. Welcome, welcome. So good to have you here. We're talking about the ego and befriending the ego, and what it might be available if we recognize the ego as an ally. Because until we can, in my opinion, this is just opinion, it's not fact, but where I am at this moment is that if we don't befriend the ego, if we don't recognize the positive sides of the ego, then we are going to be constantly at war with ourselves. And so by recognizing the good sides of the ego, by recognizing the value and the importance of our relationship with ourselves. I mean, typically, really, the self that we are most familiar with is the ego self, right? And so we all get to navigate struggles, ego struggles in our lives. You know, when we're experiencing sadness, when we're experiencing pain or joy or elation or confidence, or all of those things on the whole spectrum are ego based. And I think when we're at war with the ego, we're at war with ourselves. So now, if we're talking about transcendent spiritual experience, you know, like true spiritual transformation, then maybe there is an ego death at that time, or in that context, in which the norms of behavior and interface with the world are shifted radically, and there's no sense of personal identity any longer. However, I'm just putting it out there that what I believe, that any interface that we have with the world outside of that awakening is ego based. Welcome, welcome, Grace Isis. Good morning to you. And it's wonderful that we are present in it with each other in this morning. Beautiful. Well, welcome. So we're talking about befriending the ego, because I think we tend to be often adversarial in our relationship with ourselves. And we say, well, that's my ego. Well, when we ow, Maggie just bit my foot. She really has a thing about feet. And she bites hard and her beak is very sharp. Anyway, when we tend to recognize the ego when there are negative impacts of it, but I don't think we give it equal play when there are positive impacts of it. So lots of the joy and the kindness and the love and the connection that we feel is also coming from the ego. You know, it's not just a facet of our being that is responsible for being self-centered, or although we might make a case that pretty much everything we do is self-centered in some way or another, right? And in that respect, okay, the ego can be the, or is the identifier of self. So as long as we recognize ourselves as distinct from others, that is ego. That is an expression of the ego, right? So if we allow that the ego is an essential part of our social expression, that it is the vehicle of our social expression, perhaps we can learn maybe to tame the darkness. I mean, that's what we're all up to anyway, right? Is to be moving more into the light, and the range of emotions that we experience, the entire range of the emotions we experience resides in the ego, right? It resides in our human experience. And so by vilifying the ego, we're discounting so much of what our humanness, of the way that our humanness expresses itself, until we perhaps do transcend the ego. Good morning, Bernadette. Thank you. And Maggie says good morning to you as well. You can hear her. She's on one of the lights that I have that illuminate the space, standing up there and giving her commentary. So I'm wondering what your perspectives are on the ego, and if this is maybe a little bit of a new take to consider, that we're not the selves that we recognize without recognizing the ego that is the vehicle of that expression. Good morning, Lisa. Welcome. Oh my, you're at the dentist. Sorry about that. I hope it's not something painful. Maybe, hopefully just a routine cleaning, I hope. But yes, I've had lots of experience with dentists, and I know that can be a source of lots of trauma for people. But anyway, back to the ego. I think this is a really hot topic, because I think it expands our perception, and maybe gives us a place to create more alignment within ourselves, because I know that we often feel like we're fighting with ourselves, and naming that part that we're fighting with as the ego, I think is kind of missing a big part of the picture. Lisa says, lost a feeling, easy peasy. So good to hear that, Lisa. Good. Like I said, I've had lots of time in dentist chairs in my life. So I feel for anybody going through that, even a filling. It's the sounds and the smells and the drill and the whatever, even if it doesn't hurt. Bernadette says, totally understand her. LOL. Ego can be a good thing if it's required to push you through life. It also can be a hindrance if it allows you to see the full picture. So maybe it's a hindrance if it allows you to see the full picture. Maybe, I'm not sure if that's what you mean. I don't think we escape the ego. I think based on the definition that I read from the dictionary and a broader understanding, I think not to see the full picture. That's what I thought you meant, Bernadette. So yeah, we can be stuck in the negative aspects of ego. And if we're using the base definition of ego as the vehicle of our expression, the identity as an individual, that can get there's a spectrum of behavior there, right? And so Lisa says, ego is a bit of a double-edged sword. You need it to survive, but it can also go too far and take you down. I agree. So I think that it's very important or valuable, useful to recognize that ego is not all the negative things, not constrained or restricted or limited to all the negative things that we associate with ego typically in the culture, but that it's also all the positive expression that we have, is coming from ego. There's a distinction I think we can make between coming from an inflated sense of ego and self-importance and self righteousness, etc. And that there is also a balanced ego, that there is a balanced sense of self through which we can interface with the world. There is a more evolved sense of self when we can direct the ego in more positive expression. So Lisa says, check yourself before you wreck yourself. I love it. It's like when you get carried away with yourself, that's the ego going on a rampage, right? But I guess our ego, our sense of self, when we're connected to our source self, when we're connected to our hearts, then I believe that tends to balance the expression of the ego. Good morning, Rosalind. So exactly. So Rosalind says, I associate ego with someone who is self-absorbed. And I think that that's the cultural understanding of the ego. And the interesting thing is, I'll just read it again because I know a bunch of you came in after I read the definition of ego according to the dictionary. Let me just find it. Here we go. So the definition of ego is the I or self of any person, a person as thinking, feeling, and willing and distinguishing itself from the selves of others and from objects of its thought. And in psychoanalysis, the part of the psychic apparatus that experiences and reacts to the outside world and thus mediates between the primitive drives of the id and the demands of the social and physical environment. So I think we've been very conditioned to vilify the ego, saying it's different. The ego is distinct from being egocentric or egotistical, which is the ego run away with itself. A person running away with their own self-importance or their own, well, I think that says it well, their own self-importance. I think that a balanced ego is reacting and responding and interacting. It is the vehicle through which we interact with the world. And the reason I'm having this conversation is because I see so many of us at war with ourselves, literally at war with ourselves, like trying to kill the ego, overcome the ego, silence the ego. But the thing is, maybe what we're looking to do is to balance the ego, to find ourselves more connected and more purely present and expressed. And the ego is the vehicle through which we do that in life. When we talk about, and I'll just reiterate this, when we talk about ego death, what we're really talking about is transcendence of the individuated human experience. You know, where we're entering a realm of oneness and connection. Most of us don't live day to day from that place. And it is the ego that is our interface between whatever that spirit is manifest in this physical form and the physical social environment. So we cannot separate ourselves from the ego outside of that transcendent experience. The ego is our vehicle of communication, and when we reconcile that, I believe we have a greater ability to make peace within ourselves, to recognize that the ego is a tool. We get to utilize it as a tool to interface with the world. It is a vehicle of expression. We are individuated beings, or at least there's the illusion of our individuation here in our physicalness, right? And so part of the operating mechanism of that maybe it holds the illusion in place, maybe it's just a part of the whole mechanism, but it's inextricable. The ego is inextricable from our human expression as individuals. At least that's what I'm noticing. So I'm wondering if we talk about reframing a lot. I'm wondering if we can reframe the notion of the ego so that we don't just attribute all this nastiness to it. If we recognize that all the good stuff is part of the ego too, then maybe we can find that nastiness and transform it or redirect it in the context of a more whole view of the ego. So Bernadette says, some misunderstand the difference between ego and manipulation. Exactly. So ego gone wild, which is typically what we talk about when we talk about ego, can be manipulative, can be destructive, can be violent, can be self-righteous, self-important, etc. Right? Self-centered to a negative extreme. So there are, I'm not disputing that there are negative attributes that of which the ego can be express that the ego can express. Of course, there are negative attributes. The thing is that I think that a balanced ego, a healthy ego, is a healthy sense of self. Is a balanced sense of self that can experience love and kindness and generosity and presence and beyond. Does that make sense? I'm wondering, like, is there any freedom available to you in recognizing the possibility of redefining the ego? To say, hey, you know what? Without the ego, thank you, Bernadette. Bernadette says, absolutely. We don't have a vehicle of expression that is separate from the ego. What we can become radiant beings of light, in which case we have no sense of self. That's a huge transcendent action or huge transcendent place of presence, but most of us don't live there. And when we're interacting in life, all of that interaction is from the ego. It's all contained in the ego. It's all driven by this sense of individuation, this sense of I can't even say it a better way. I don't think. I think it's this sense of individuation, and on a certain level, we know that we're all one, right? But and my physicalness is perceptually distinct from your physicalness, and part of what might be holding that illusion in place is the ego. You know, the ego is the expression that's part of that individuation. They're inseparable. So as long as we are experiencing and perceiving ourselves as individuals, whatever the level of our connection, then we are residing in the ego. So it's not all bad is all I'm saying. I'm saying it's a spectrum. And if it's a spectrum, if it's all part of one thing, then we get to recognize that whatever the darkness is that the ego shows up can potentially be converted to light, right? Because it's all part of the same thing. So when we recognize behaviors that we don't like in ourselves, we get to shift those behaviors, right? It's still the ego that's helping to move that needle one way or another. The foundation is whether the ego is self-aware or not. Welcome, Elaine. Welcome. So Elaine says there is healthy ego and an unhealthy or wounded ego caused by trauma. Exactly. That it's all ego, right? If this is the case, one only needs to go within and love those parts unconditionally, back into the one true self-love. When this is completed, there's no separation felt, seen, or known. And so, Elaine, I think that you breathe somewhat rare air, in that there are not many people that are able to be consistently present, or have not discovered the way to be consistently present to our oneness beyond the individuation. And so the spectrum of ego expression. And so I invite you to play with that idea, because by vilifying the ego, what we're doing is we are separating ourselves from the parts of ourselves, from parts of ourselves. So if we're interpreting that ego is just all the negative expression of my individual being in this humanness that we are experiencing, then I'm not owning those parts of myself, right? And if I'm saying that's the ego, it's like it's something that isn't me, or isn't part of, or isn't fundamental to my expression in the world. And Elaine says it's not about consistency, it's about practice. Trusting your own process as you awaken to the one true self is tailored individually to each soul. I agree with you, Elaine, that we each have our own journey. And I'm just suggesting here that when we allow for all aspects of ourself, when we are able to accept and embrace all aspects of ourselves, then we come to a wholeness. We come to an integration that allows for a release of the resistance that keeps us from experiencing ourselves as whole and connected. And it is part of our personal evolution. And I'm just thinking that this whole ego thing, the way that we've perceived the ego has been really tainted by negativity. So interestingly, like I have a conversation with some of my clients that are hearing this voice that is telling them they're bad, they're wrong, whatever. And historically, this voice, this negative input would be, oh, well, that's the ego talking. And so I've renamed that for my clients to say that's the bully. That's the bully. That's like programming and input from the past or from other people that is there to just sort of try and keep you doing the same things. And those behaviors, or that intention, has been ascribed in lots of conversations that I've experienced to the ego. And maybe it is one aspect of the ego, but it is not the ego in its entirety. And so renaming it the bully gives us an opportunity to say, oh, you're the bully. I don't need to play with you. Go play in your own place and let me be. And that way we get to recognize the ego as a whole thing. We might have a wounded ego. We might have a healthy ego. We might have all of the above, in different aspects. But I'm not looking to give us ways to separate ourselves from ourselves. And maybe the bully, I don't know, I have found that identifying the bully is a useful tool. I just take issue with characterizing that as the ego, because that's really an incomplete notion of what the ego is and the necessity for it. I mean, it is our interface with the world. It is the self through which we integrate and interface with the world. It may not be our soul self. It may not be our true essence, which is spirit in this physical form, right? And we do talk about ego death, again, being the transcendence of the experience of individuation, pretty much. So thank you for nerding out with me on this topic. I think it's a good and interesting topic. I think it's there are insights available to us and greater freedoms available to us through really looking at what the ego is and how it serves us, how it is our vehicle of expression, and what it looks like to have a balanced ego or to be out of balance, et cetera, et cetera. So on that note, I just want to say, I really do appreciate your engagement with these musings. It's very fulfilling to me and enriching, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you. And I think that's it for this morning. So I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page every weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on the Enlightened World Network pages, Enlightened World Living, and EWN, one with the earth. So until next time, so much love and deep, deep, deep appreciation for